Eleanor was the kind of woman who could silence a room without saying a single word. Her reputation reached beyond the walls of her mansion, and people spoke of her as if she were a storm you never wanted to get caught in. She carried herself with elegance and wealth, but her eyes, cold, sharp, and unyielding, were what people remembered most. To cross her path meant inviting humiliation, because Eleanor had a way of cutting people down with words sharper than any blade. The staff who worked under her moved through the house like shadows, careful not to make mistakes, careful not to be noticed. A dropped fork, a late arrival, even the smallest flaw became an invitation for her scorn. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of judgment that left people trembling. It wasn't that she shouted, she rarely raised her voice. It was the precision of her cruelty, the calm way she made someone feel small, that left scars long after the moment had passed. Guests at the mansion admired the wealth but dreaded the woman who ruled over it. Behind her back, whispers floated, stories of how she once reduced a visiting friend to tears, how she dismissed loyal servants without hesitation, how she laughed at vulnerability as if kindness was a weakness. Yet despite all the fear, no one confronted her. Her power, her money, and her unshakable presence kept everyone silent. Eleanor seemed untouchable, a queen in her own kingdom, and everyone knew the safest way to survive was to stay out of her way. Rosa arrived at the mansion on a bright Monday morning, carrying nothing but a small bag and a heart full of hope. Unlike the other staff, she didn't seem intimidated by the grand gates, the towering walls, or the whispers of warning she'd heard on her way in. To her, it was simply a job, an opportunity to work hard and help her family back home. But to the others, it was stepping into a lion's den, and they looked at her with pity. "Be careful," one of the older maids whispered as they showed her around. "The mistress doesn't tolerate mistakes. Keep your head down, and don't ever speak unless spoken to." Rosa only smiled politely and nodded, though deep inside she wondered why kindness should be hidden like a secret. Her first encounter with Eleanor came sooner than expected. As Rosa polished the silver in the dining hall, the air shifted, and in walked the millionaire's wife, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a clock counting down. The other servants stiffened, bowing their heads, afraid even to breathe too loudly. Rosa, however, simply looked up, met Eleanor's gaze for a brief second, and greeted her with a soft, "Good morning, ma'am." The room froze. No one had ever dared to speak so simply, so warmly, to Eleanor. The older maids exchanged anxious glances, certain that Rosa's boldness had just sealed her fate. But Eleanor, after a slight pause, walked past in silence, her expression unreadable. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew Rosa was different. The grand dining hall glittered that evening, filled with chandeliers, polished silver, and guests in gowns and suits that cost more than most servants earned in a year. The air was thick with forced laughter and the clinking of glasses, but beneath it all lingered tension, because Eleanor was watching everything. She sat at the head of the table, regal and intimidating, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. When a young servant nervously poured wine, his hand trembled, and a single drop splashed onto the white tablecloth. The room seemed to stop breathing. Eleanor's gaze locked onto him like a predator. With icy precision, she said, "How clumsy. Do you have any idea what this fabric costs? Perhaps clumsiness is all you'll ever be known for." The servant's face burned with shame, his eyes cast downward as the guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Before anyone could move, Rosa stepped forward. She took the tray gently from the servant's shaking hands and placed it on the table. In a calm but steady voice, she said, "Mistakes happen. What matters is how we treat people when they do. After all, kindness costs nothing, even when fabric does." Gasps rippled around the table. The guests looked at Rosa in disbelief. No one had ever dared to speak against Eleanor, certainly not a maid. Eleanor's face flushed crimson, her jaw tightening as if the weight of authority had just been challenged in front of her empire. For a moment, it seemed the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if Eleanor would destroy the maid who had dared to confront her. Eleanor's lips curved into a tight smile, the kind that carried more venom than warmth. She opened her mouth, ready to slice Rosa down with words that would leave her trembling. But something unexpected happened. One of the guests, a well-dressed woman seated near the end of the table, cleared her throat softly and said, "She's right, you know. We all make mistakes." Another guest nodded in agreement, murmuring, "Grace in those moments matters more than perfection." The weight of the room shifted. Instead of laughing politely at Eleanor's remarks, the guests were siding with the maid. Their eyes no longer carried admiration for the millionaire's wife, they carried quiet judgment. Eleanor felt it like a blade. For years, she had been feared, obeyed, even envied. But in that instant, surrounded by the silence of those who no longer applauded her cruelty, she realized she was standing alone. Her gaze flicked to Rosa, who stood calm and unshaken, her hands folded neatly, her eyes steady with compassion rather than defiance. And it struck Eleanor in a way she hadn't felt in years. This girl, with no money, no power, no status, had done what no one else dared. She held up a mirror. In Rosa's presence, Eleanor saw herself clearly, not as a woman of strength and dignity, but as a figure of fear and loneliness. The dining hall buzzed faintly as the guests shifted uncomfortably, waiting for her reaction. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt her power slipping, not because it was taken, but because it no longer commanded respect. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her vast bedroom, staring at the chandelier above her. The silence felt heavier than any words spoken at dinner. Rosa's voice echoed in her mind, "Kindness costs nothing." For years, Eleanor had built her world on fear, mistaking it for respect. But now, for the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to be loved instead of feared. By morning, her decision was made. When the staff gathered for their daily instructions, they braced themselves for Rosa's dismissal. Instead, Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke. "I owe you all an apology," she began. The staff exchanged stunned glances. Eleanor continued, her eyes lowered, her words uncharacteristically soft. "I have treated you with cruelty and demanded perfection where I offered none. That ends today. From this moment forward, I ask for your forgiveness, and your patience, as I learn how to change." The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. Then, slowly, Rosa stepped forward and offered her a gentle smile. "Change begins with honesty, ma'am. That's more than enough for now." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, though she quickly brushed them away. In that moment, the feared millionaire's wife became human again, not untouchable, not perfect, but someone finally brave enough to be vulnerable. From then on, the mansion was different. Laughter returned to its halls, and the staff no longer walked in fear. Eleanor began inviting Rosa for tea, not as a servant, but as a friend. And in the heart of the woman once feared by all, kindness finally bloomed.